Will the United States and China go to war? In this episode, we're going to try and answer the most pressing geopolitical question of our time using astrology. This is World Astrology Report. I'm your host, Dan Waits. If you like this channel, please hit the like button and subscribe to it now. Now, a few weeks ago, I posted a video on the Uranus-Mars-Rahu conjunction in Taurus. Now, in that video, I referred to a very similar configuration that appeared in the skies in 157 BCE. Now, around that time, the Roman statesman Cato the Elder visited Carthage, a great rival to Rome across the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Rome and Carthage had already fought 2 wars against each other. And Cato, when he went to Carthage, didn't like what he saw. He saw that Carthage had returned to prosperity, and he became determined that Rome had to destroy Carthage. Now, many years later, Cato got his wish. Rome and Carthage went to war again, and Carthage was destroyed. Now, moving back to today, I can't help but see some striking archetypal similarities with something that happened on the day of the Uranus-Mars-Rahu conjunction. The Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan, and she did so against Chinese threats and even against the wishes of President Joe Biden. Now, Nancy Pelosi and Cato the Elder are very different figures in many ways, but I can't help but see some intriguing similarities. Both senior politicians crossing the ocean on imperial business, and on both occasions we see the result, rumblings of war. Now, the Chinese reacted furiously to Pelosi's visit. They launched cyber attacks against Taiwan. They held military drills in the Taiwan Strait and invaded Taiwanese waters. They also fired missiles over Taiwan. Now, China has also cancelled its military cooperation and cooperation on climate change with the United States as a result of Pelosi's visit. The question everybody's asking is, where will this go? Will this lead to war? The reason we need to ask this question is that the US is committed to defending Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has pledged to reunify what China views as a renegade province with the mainland. He staked his legacy on achieving this. Needless to say, these are frightening times, but now let's dig into the astrology, which is speaking to what's happening right now. First, we should look at the wider astrological context, and that context is the dawning of the Age of Air. Now, if you don't know what I mean by the Age of Air, I addressed this subject thoroughly in my last video. The Age of Air will change everything. Again, find the link in the description below. Transitions between elemental ages, as we've just been through, have historically coincided with big geopolitical shifts, and this one will be no different. Now, I have some reason to believe that China has experienced some of its golden ages during previous ages of air. This is something I need to do more research on and that I'll be posting videos about in the future. But there's another reason why the Age of Air is really important here. Our modern societies increasingly depend upon information technology. Now, Taiwan, through the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, manufactures more than 92% of all the advanced semiconductors in the world right now. Those semiconductors lie at the heart of almost all advanced civilian and military information technology. So what we find is that the economies of both the United States and China are highly dependent on Taiwan, and this is a big reason why that island is so crucial to geopolitics right now. Hello friends, yes, I've changed my shirt. I'm just going to interrupt the narrative for a few seconds to remind you that I am a consulting astrologer, and I currently have spaces in my schedule to meet new clients. Now, in my practice, I use traditional and modern techniques to help people find their place and purpose in the world. That's particularly valuable right now during these difficult, transformative times, and I'd love to see some of you for one-on-ones. If you'd like to book a consultation, just head to my website, danwaitesastrology.com, and click on the Book a Consultation button in the top right. Okay, let's get back to it. But if we want to get a clearer picture of relations between the US and China, we have to look to planetary cycles, specifically the Saturn-Pluto cycle. Now, I've written about this cycle before. You can find an article on this subject again in the description below. I've talked about how the last Saturn-Pluto cycle from 1982 to 2020 coincided with China's great rise and with the US's involvement in the Middle East, which culminated on September the 11th, 2001 with the 9/11 attacks. But I've done more research since then, and what I've found is that the Saturn-Pluto cycle also speaks very clearly to relations between the United States and China. So if we can convince ourselves that the Saturn-Pluto cycle does indeed speak to those relations, we can then use it to forecast the future. That's what we're going to do in this episode. Now, one principle that I rely on very heavily in my mundane astrology is the principle that conjunctions show the promise of whole cycles. Now, let's start in 1982 at the time of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. This was a historic year in US-China relations. The US and China issued the third of what were called the three joint communiques, in which the United States affirmed its one China policy, which acknowledged the Chinese state's claim that there was only one state of China and that both mainland China and Taiwan were part of it. In the same year, the US President Ronald Reagan issued what were called his 6 assurances. Among those assurances was a promise that the US would not mediate between the two sides, and eventually it would stop selling arms to Taiwan, although it didn't specify when. Now, ultimately, 1982 was characterized by cooperation between the US and China. The two states acknowledged their differences, but agreed to put them aside for the sake of peace and development. And that's basically what happened over that whole cycle. Now, in 1989, Saturn and Pluto reached the sextile aspect. Now, a sextile is a weakly harmonious aspect. It's similar to a trine, but not as strong. What happened in 1989? The Tiananmen Square massacre. At this time, up to 1 million people protested at Beijing's Tiananmen Square, led by students. Now, the Chinese Communist Party wanted to put down this rebellion, and it did so using the army. They sent the army in, and the army used their weapons to kill hundreds of students. It was something that invited revulsion all around the world. Now, many people were demanding that the US issue a strong response to this massacre. It flew in the face of everything that the US claimed to stand for. The US president at the time, George H.W. Bush, took a soft approach that he was heavily criticized for, but he wanted to prioritize maintaining good relations with China. Here we see the harmonious nature of the sextile at work. Now, in 1993, Saturn and Pluto reached the waxing square. Now, by this time, the United States had a new president, President Bill Clinton. And Clinton had campaigned during 1992 against George H.W. Bush on a platform of taking stronger measures against China. He wanted to pressure China on its human rights record. He tried to use economic pressure to get the Chinese to make human rights reforms, but ultimately his pressure failed. The Chinese didn't make those reforms and he gave up. Now, in 1997, Saturn and Pluto reached the waxing trine, a harmonious aspect. And in that year, President Jiang Zemin of China visited the United States. It was the first visit of a serving Chinese president to US soil in a long, long time. The US reiterated its one China policy at this time, and the two states pledged to build a strategic partnership. Now, in 2001, Saturn-Pluto reached an opposition. And this year was crucial in China-US relations. Oppositions are moments of reckoning where the promise of a cycle comes to fruition. There are also inflection points, turning points. Now, in 2001, with American support, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a huge deal. This gave China access to markets around the world, and it also resulted in huge amounts of manufacturing capacity moving to Chinese soil. It led to China becoming the powerhouse it is today. Now, that opposition also manifested in an incredibly literal fashion. Now, on the 1st of April 2001, a US spy plane was in a head-on collision with a Chinese fighter jet. The Chinese fighter pilot was killed, and the US spy plane was forced to make an emergency landing on China's Hainan Island. That's why this is referred to as the Hainan Island incident. Another really interesting thing about that is that the US spy plane was named Aries 2, and this incident took place with the sun in the second decan of Aries, which astrologers would refer to as Aries 2. Now, from this moment onwards, Saturn took superior position to Pluto, and we see how things begin to change in terms of the US-China relationship. In 2007, Saturn and Pluto reached the Waning trine. Now, this year, China launched a lunar orbiter called the Chang'e-1. It pledged to put a man on the moon by 2022. It also increased its defense spending by 18%, and it carried out a missile test against one of its own satellites, proving that it had the ability to shoot down satellites at will. Now, it's not especially clear how the trine is manifesting here, but I would note that the US at the time was preoccupied with wars in the Middle East. It didn't react strongly to these shows of force by the Chinese. Now, in 2010, Saturn and Pluto reached the Waning Square, again an aspect of friction and conflict. China became the second largest economy in the world. So at this point, the US and China became the world's two largest economies and became direct competitors for economic dominance. Now we reach the final aspect of this cycle. In 2013, we hit the waning sextile, again, a harmonious aspect. What happened at this time? US President Barack Obama tried to build rapport with new Chinese President Xi Jinping. The Chinese president came to the US, and Obama and Xi spent 8 hours together at the Sunnylands estate in California. They were able to come to some agreement on certain issues, including North Korea and climate change, but crucially they were unable to come to an accord on US arms sales to Taiwan. This was an issue that came up at the conjunction in 1982. So again, what we can see is that in 1982 we saw cooperation, albeit uneasy, between China and the US. And what happened in the 1982 to 2020 cycle as a whole, we saw uneasy cooperation between the US and China. Now, on the 12th of January 2020, we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. This ended the previous cycle and started the new one, the cycle we're currently in. And what happened at that time, I think we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic. On January the 11th, the first news reports came out saying somebody had died in China of a mysterious virus in Wuhan. We all know what happened next. Now, the current cycle, the cycle that began then in 2020, will take us to 2053. What's it going to be about? Well, I think some of the themes that we can expect to see are disease and its management, and questions about the distribution of information, about disinformation and misinformation. All of these issues were crucial during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they show what will happen over the whole cycle we're in now. But what about US-China relations, the subject of this video? Now, to understand that, we need to think about what happened while the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in orb. And Saturn and Pluto were within 15 degrees of orb from roughly the start of 2018 to the end of 2021. Now, of course, until the end of 2020, the US was administered by President Donald J. Trump. Now, I'm going to make 3 observations about that period now, especially the period following the outbreak of the pandemic. First observation is that China thrived. Now, of course, it was a challenge for China to manage the pandemic, and it did so using extremely draconian measures that most countries couldn't contemplate. But manage it did. China was able to maintain almost 0 levels of COVID, and it was able to function almost as normal, even though it was sealed off from the rest of the world. At the same time, the rest of the world was ravaged heavily by the pandemic. Now, in 2020, when a lot of world economies, including that of the US, shrank, China's actually grew by 2.2%. Now, of course, China is now running into trouble because it's trying to maintain its zero COVID policy, and that's exponentially more difficult because the virus is far more contagious than it ever was. But those difficulties have come after the conjunction was in orb. This is crucial. Now, my second observation of that period is that the US floundered. Now, the United States has been hit really hard by the pandemic. More than 1 million Americans have lost their lives. And in 2020, while the Chinese economy was still growing, the US economy shrank by 3.4%. Now, my third observation is that US-China relations deteriorated. Now, even before 2020, when the pandemic hit, President Donald Trump was notably hostile to China. He imposed tariffs on Chinese imports and essentially started a trade war with the country. Then when the pandemic began, he blamed China for it. He called it the China virus. He circulated stories that the virus had escaped from a lab. Now, China, for its part, used the pandemic for its own propagandistic purposes. It trumpeted its success in managing the pandemic when other countries failed, and it even claimed that the outbreak was the result of a US biological weapons attack. So with these observations in mind, we can make predictions about what's going to take place during this Saturn-Pluto cycle. And unlike the last one, which was characterized by cooperation, I think this one is likely to be characterized by hostility and possibly confrontation. We should also note the trade war that Trump started around the time of the conjunction. I think what we may well see is the US and China trying to decouple their economies. Right now, conflict would be extremely damaging to both of them. They both rely on each other for their economic success. Now, one more conclusion we can draw about this cycle is that the US is likely to fare much worse than China in managing the issues it centers around. These will include disease and the management of information and disinformation. We already saw how these issues created huge divisions in US society, and unfortunately, I think that's going to continue. So if we're thinking about US-China relations through the prism of this Saturn-Pluto cycle, what conclusions can we draw about timing? Well, the first thing we can note is that China and the United States are not likely to confront each other for a few years. That would imply that the current volatile situation in the Taiwan Strait will die down. Now, in terms of timing of events during this cycle, we need to look to the next major aspect, which is the sextile coming in March 2026. Now, sextiles are harmonious aspects. Perhaps a new US president following their election in 2024 will attempt to heal deteriorating relations between these two states. Unfortunately, given our understanding of the nature of this cycle, I don't think these attempts are likely to work. Alternatively, we could see challenging developments in either state that the other state doesn't react to, as we saw during the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, that sextile will be followed by the square in mid-2028 and 2029. As we've seen, squares are aspects of conflict and friction. They're of the nature of Mars. And for this reason, I think here we arrive at the first truly perilous moment of this cycle. What's especially worrying is the testimony of some other astrological factors around this time. At this point, Uranus will be in the sign of Gemini. Now, whenever Uranus has been in Gemini, which is the 7th house of the US Sibley chart, the house of open enemies, the United States has engaged in transformative armed conflicts. We had the Revolutionary War, we had the Civil War, and then we had the Second World War. Now, Neptune will also be in Aries at this time, and Neptune signifies where the collective imagination is directed towards. And in Aries, we should see it directed towards adventure, innovation, but unfortunately that could also mean it's directed towards the idea of war. So with all these factors in mind, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that we face the risk of a serious confrontation between the United States and China around 2028-2029. Now, if we think back to what happened during the Cold War between the US and the USSR, this could take the form conceivably of some kind of proxy war in which the two states don't directly engage each other. But if we think about the case of Taiwan, the United States is committed to defending Taiwan, and President Xi Jinping has staked his legacy on reintegrating Taiwan with the Chinese state. Now, in my previous video on the Age of Air, I discussed what conflict is likely to look like during this epoch. Modes of conflict during this Age of Air are likely to include cyber war, extensive use of drones and autonomous weapons, as well as space war and possibly even biological weapons. What's also important to bear in mind here is that the United States itself is likely heading for a kind of internal crisis in the late 2020s. This is something I'm going to address in a future video. But what we can observe is that the present dysfunction in the United States seems to be making the country in its current form increasingly unviable. The gulf between the values of liberal and conservative Americans only seems to grow and become unbridgeable. So if the United States becomes consumed with internal conflict and distracted by internal matters, could China take advantage of the situation to invade Taiwan? An equally dangerous moment of this cycle will come in 2035 at the Saturn-Pluto opposition. At this time, we're likely to see the full fruition of this difficult cycle. And the other thing that worries me is that in 2034, we'll have a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in the sign of Cancer. Now, these conjunctions happen every 2 years, but they were held to be especially troublesome in the sign of Cancer, where both planets are considered debilitated. This was the great malefic conjunction, which heralded a new 30-year cycle of woe. Given the promise of this cycle, I think 2035 is going to be a real turning point, a moment at which it becomes clear that China has the upper hand, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, if this doesn't happen in 2028. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe if you haven't done already, and also share it with anybody you think would find it interesting. See you next time.